Okay, so we're going to do a quick demo showing you a couple of ways to blend acrylics. The first way you already know, you've all been doing it for quite a while in the class, and that is the same way that you do a color string. So I put the colors more or less where they belong on the palette, but to do a color string, you want the colors to be a little distance apart. Take part of the Raw Sienna here, take a chunk of the white, work across to a middle value, and then mix from that to the Raw Sienna, and from that to the white. And you can do that over and over, just creating a pretty soft transition, which is a wet on wet grid, wet on wet blend, okay? So that you already know how to do, and it's a pretty simple thing to duplicate on the palette. So I've got a couple of little spots here where we're gonna work. Okay, to do this, I've just got a couple of pretty inexpensive brushes. These are cheap. This one is soft. This one is stiffer. This is a little better brush. It's a very good brush. But I want to show you the transitions don't depend on that. Don't depend on having a really fantastic brush. Can be done with a knife. People have been blending. I've got a couple of paper towels in case this gets out of hand. My spray bottle to keep the paint just misted. You don't have to keep it soggy. My bucket of water. That's about it. That's all. That's really all you need. I've divided this up into 4 areas, just like I have. So the first one we're going to do is just a wet on wet blend. That's where you take a little bit of one color on one end, a little bit of the other color on the other end. With acrylics, it's a good idea to dampen your brushes before you work so the paint doesn't dry in the brush. Okay, so having put a little bit of the Raw Sienna down, a little bit of the white down, what I'm do is paint them right up to each other, and then I'm just going to push back and forth across that line. I could stop there and just say, there, done. I have a transition. But if you go across and change the angle just a little bit with the brush strokes, you can continue to blend this. Now, at a certain point, if you keep blending, it'll just all become one color, right? And one of the reasons to have a soft, clean brush nearby, and people use fan brushes and other kinds of very soft brushes, but if you've got a soft, clean brush nearby, you can make this transition pretty smooth, right? And if you're looking for control, one of the other things you can do with this, if you're looking for a bit more control, is that wet on wet blend also works pretty well if, let's see, where would I do this? If I have a shape here and a shape here, and I want the two to be blended, clean my brush, but clean, not bone dry, because I don't want the paint to dry in it, but just scrub back and forth across that point. So I have a little bit more control. Again, clean my brush, scrub back and forth across that point. Clean my brush. So I can make this as gentle as I want, or I can make it as sharp as I want. So you have got great deal of control. Make a long gradation, make a pretty quick gradation, or just make 2 colors that are just beside each other and scrub between them. So wet on wet transition is pretty easy to control. Okay, this next one takes a second to set up, but it's the same basic idea. First, I make my color string. I get it in pretty decent shape. And then I start at one end, and starting with the weaker color, which in this case is the Raw Sienna, put down a mark of the Raw Sienna. I realize it's not a terribly dark color. And then I just move down the color string. I grab the next color, And the next color, and the next color, on down the line as I move between one color and the next. And depending on the width of these little stripes, I'm gonna have a very, very controlled transition. But I can do the very same thing with this. And the reason to move sort of quickly on this, a couple of twofold. One, I actually have a series of kind of sharp transitions between subtly related colors, right? So if it's between black and white, it's just a series of subtle steps. So I can, once again, take a soft, almost dry brush, and just use the soft bristles. So the difference between a soft brush and a stiffer brush is a stiff brush is going to be used kind of like a shovel. I can lay the paint down and leave it alone. That's great for those purposes. A soft brush you're not gonna be able to lift up much paint with it, but it's wonderful for manipulating the surface of the paint, more like a broom or a rake. All right, it's not something you're gonna move a lot of material with, it's something that you're gonna rearrange the surface with, okay? So it's a fine tool for that. At the extreme, a very soft brush with very few hairs in it, it's called a fan brush. And a fan brush looks like this, and it has the same principle, which is I'm just going across and there are only a few bristles and only a tiny bit of it touches the surface at a time. It's not great for acrylics, and this is dry, so it would get damaged if I dipped it into these acrylics, okay? This is more of an oil painting tool. All right. Okay, for this next process, what I'm gonna do is just put down, again, the weaker color, so the Raw Sienna. I'm gonna put the Raw Sienna down and cover the area that I'm painting. So you could paint an entire canvas, or say you were working on a sky or something like that. I'm just gonna lay a pretty solid chunk of that color down. I'll put a little more down just to make it really evident what we're doing. Raw Sienna is a pretty mild color. That's why it's so great for underpainting. It's pretty weak. It's weak tinting, so it makes very gentle transitions. But it's also transparent and doesn't have great coverage, all of which are real advantages in an underpainting. Okay, but I'm gonna lay down a pretty thick chunk of Raw Sienna and just blend it out or paint it out so that I don't have too huge of chunks and transitions, and then I'm going to let it dry. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna do that on both spots. So both of the next transitions are gonna start with that. So this is where you want to blend one color, same visual effect that you're getting here, which is a transition from Raw Sienna to white. So that's from a transparent color to an opaque color, or from an opaque color to an opaque color, or from a very strong color to a less strong color. All of these transitions work just fine, but you can see that the Raw Sienna is a weaker color of these two. Also, one of the things is you can go over these transitions. When you have transparent colors like this, on your first pass, you might just kind of chunk in these transitions, but you can always come back later and repeat these transitions, and layers of subtle transitions with transparent color creates an effect called sfumato in oil paint, which can be really beautiful, just really delicate, transparent transitions, because the transition will be just a tiny bit different in each one. So ultimately, over time, 4 or 5 of those on top of each other, get a really beautiful, delicate, and transparent effect, which is beautiful for painting flesh. It's been about 6 months. No, it's been quite a while. The golden opens do exactly what they're supposed to do, which is even on a warm, dry day, they remain workable, which is not a complaint. That's praise. The heater was on through part of the morning, so there was warm, dry air blowing through the studio. And this is still just a little tacky. Right? You can see I can lift paint. So you don't want to be able to do that. We're going to be painting directly over these. In fact, we're going to be rubbing other paint into the surface. So we want this to be completely dry. So that's why these blends, these processes may be faster. And they're the processes that you're already familiar with, being able to work wet on wet, being able to make small gradated color changes and then blend them together or not. Okay, this one is totally dry. This one's still, I'm able to lift a little of the paint in the corner. So that's going to help me to decide which paint sample to do which process on. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of matte medium. Doesn't matter the brand. An open medium will clearly stay open for a second longer. But what you're going to do is put just a little bit of medium on your palette. Doesn't take much. And then you're going to take a clean brush. And I'm going to mix just a little bit of water with the medium so that the medium stays wet. And as always, my brush was slightly damp before I dipped it into the paint so that the paint would not dry on my brush. Okay, and then I'm going to brush this medium into the area that I want to work. And as I said, with just a tiny bit of water so that it stays open. Now, if I keep scrubbing at this, one of the things you saw from how easy it is to clean the palette, acrylics will lift for several days. If you scrub with water on a wet painting, you can lift the paint. So if I go over this long enough times, I will damage the painting irreparably. So don't wet and scrub at the surface. Your blending should be done pretty lightly, which is one of the reasons it's done with a softer brush, okay, so that you don't damage the painting. Okay, so what I've done is I've put the paint down here. I've got the damp medium across the surface, and then I'm going to blend, instead of mixing it into the other paint, I'm mixing it into the medium. So I'm actually mixing on top of the paint. This has a couple of interesting advantages. One is that in theory, if you were super careful, you could lift this paint. If you made a mistake, you could lift the paint, which you can do very easily with oil paint. With acrylics, however, it's a little tougher visually, right? So glazing, this would be glazing the color over. So I'm mixing the white into a glaze. If I used a slow drying glaze, I could move very slowly across this. Or if I put a little bit more water into the glaze, I could work that very, very slowly with soft brushes. But since this is a quick drying glaze and a warm day, then I need to move pretty fast. This is a great way to blend, right? You can lay your painting down, skies, lots of other spaces, adding light, moving, but you can see each one has a little bit different feeling. All right, now we're going to do the last one, and for this, I need a separate surface. I'm going to use the back of one of these pieces of paper. There's one that's more messed up than the other. No? Okay. What I'm going to do is take the brush. Again, I want it to be clean, and in this case, I want it to be dry, almost bone dry. So I'm going to really dry the brush. I'm going to brush it back and forth over this dry paper towel and try to get all of the water that I can out of it in the tip, but I don't want to get it completely dry up here. I don't want the paint to dry in the brush. And you'll see why that's a little bit problematic, because the name of the process is dry brush. And dry brushing is when you get the paint down to an almost dry level. So it's when the paint starts to get sticky, and this is why you want to practice it a few times. And then you take that paint and you dust across the surface where the paint is only sticking to the parts of the canvas that are raised. Now what's interesting about this is the drier the paint is, the easier it is to control. So if I'm pick up this paint when it's still pretty wet, I'll have a harder time controlling it. I might have a little bit sharper edges, but by just varying the angle of my application a little bit as I go across this, I can have a very, very gentle, controlled gradation. And I can come back, I can let this paint dry, and like the other processes, I can layer this. So I have several layers of dry paint. But like any other process with acrylics, if I continue to scrub at this, what happens is the moisture in the paint is attacking the paint underneath. And that's why I said this one, because that one isn't quite as dry. If I scrub it that long enough, it will eventually start to lift or interact with the other paint, which is not what I want to do. Okay, and then I want to clean that brush immediately, because the paint will otherwise dry in the brush, and I will literally have a dry brush process. Okay, so what you can see is these two processes, the paint is on top of the Raw Sienna, or black or blue or whatever you're working with, and this, it's mixed into it. So these are not just different approaches, they yield very different results. They feel different. This painting into the glaze, particularly in a fast drying glaze, means working quickly. It has kind of a loose feeling. It doesn't interact. The brush strokes underneath are not affected by the brush strokes on top. In this case, it's all on one layer, and they're blended wet on wet. So the processes in this case are wet on wet. This is a gradient that's mixed and then applied. So I just mix each color, lay them down side by side. This is dry brush. And this one is a glazed. Glazed and confused. So wet on wet, gradient, glazed, dry brush. 4 different ways to blend your acrylics, and they can all be worked over one another. You could do this and then glaze over it. You could do this, let it dry, and dry brush over it. So these can be interactive. You can glaze over dry brush after it dries, but you want the layers to dry completely on these. So before you do these processes, the layer underneath needs to be completely dry. These, the paint needs to be equally wet in order to do that last little bit of blending. So this is a great all-on-one layer kind of blending approach. This is good if you're working in large areas and in steps. Okay, so now you have a couple of options to help you get through your paintings, and some of the conditions that you're painting in will affect this. On a wet day, these processes will stay open a little bit longer, and these will be a bit more difficult. On a dry day, the paint will dry faster, so these processes will be more available to you. Okay? There you go. I hope you enjoy it. Please send me any questions you might have. Have fun.